I'd like to start today's show with a classic poem that was first introduced to modern cowboy poetry audiences by today's guest. This piece is entitled Where the Ponies Come to Drink by Henry Herbert Knibbs, and it's from Nibs' 1914 book entitled Songs of the Outlands, Ballads of the Hobos, and Other Verse. Here's Where the Ponies Come to Drink. Up in northern Arizona, there's a ranger trail that passes through a mesa, like a fairy lake with pines upon its brink. And across the trail, a stream runs, all but hidden in the grasses, till it finds an emerald hollow where the ponies come to drink. Out they fling across the mesa, wind-blown manes and forelocks dancing, blacks and sorrels, bays and pintos, wild as eagles, eyes agleam. From their hooves the silver flashes, burning beads and arrows glancing through the bunch grass and the grama as they cross the little stream. Down they swing as if pretending in their orderly disorder that they've stopped to hold a powwow, just to rally for the charge that will take them close to sunset, 20 miles across the border. Then the leader sniffs and drinks with 4 feet planted on the marge. One by one each head is lowered, till some yearling nips another, and the playful interruption starts an eddy in the band. Snorting, squealing, plunging, wheeling, round they circle in a smother of the muddy spray, nor pause until they find the firmer land. My old cow horse, he runs with 'em. Turned him loose for good last season. 18 years hard work, his record, and he's earned his little rest. And he's taken it by playing, acting proud, and with good reason. Though he's starched a little forward, he can fan it with the best. Once I called him, almost caught him, when he heard my spur change jingle. Then he eyed me some reproachful, as if making up his mind, seemed to say, "Well, if I have to, but you know I'm living single." So I laughed. In just a minute, he was pretty hard to find. Some folks wouldn't understand it, writing lines about a pony. For a cow horse is a cow horse, nothing else, most people think. But for 18 years, your partner, wise and faithful, such a crony, seems worth watching for a spell. Down where the ponies come to drink. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Tom Sharpe. Tom Sharpe is a horseman and a poet from western Colorado. He says that he was convinced from an early age that one must be good with horses to be good with cows, and he has spent his life studying horses and following cows. Tom has been a longtime performer at cowboy poetry gatherings in Elko, Nevada, Alpine, Texas, Durango, Colorado, and other places. Tom and his folklorist wife, Ronna Lee, are known for their knowledge of the classic poet Henry Herbert Knibbs, and have contributed to publications about Knibbs' life and work. I sat down with Tom in Alpine, Texas, during the Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering and recorded this interview. Here's Tom Sharpe.
Okay, I was born and raised in Trinidad, Colorado, about 20 miles north of the New Mexico line. My dad was from southern Georgia, and keeping in mind that Georgia is a penal colony, those folks down there never really have changed much. But he met my mom, who was a daughter of immigrants and grand immigrants. They come from Italy. Granddad run a packing plant there in Trinidad. My grandmother's sisters run a dry goods store. They were in the dry goods business back when they were hauling stuff to the mining camps out of Trinidad, back up the canyon there. Trinidad has two things, cows and coal. Anyway, my early memories, my dad was working for my granddad, and they ended up with a little feedlot that went along with that packing plant. And I spent the majority of my time outside there. My aunts and grandfolks always wanted me to become a merchant in business like they were, but it wasn't going to work for me. I couldn't be inside. I had to have it outside. So I spent my time, like I say, at that feedlot and ended up with, 4-H projects and calves and horses, and even showed a pig once. It didn't work out so good. I like pigs on a plate. Beyond that, I have no use for them. My dad started me riding colts when I was about 8 years old just to get me out of his hair, and put me on some colts that, when you're 8 years old, you're a little young to know much about a horse. It was a matter of falling off enough to learn how to stay on top. And I had a couple of little half-Welsh ponies that he started me on, and one of them, I had him, I don't know, day 3, 4 or something. I rode him out up in the yard where him and the hired hand were loading grain to feed the cattle in that little feedlot. We didn't have trucks and stuff then. My dad asked me if I had him hat broke and proceeded to throw his hat right underneath that little brown horse. And that sucker dumped me in that gravel yard, just nailed me hard. And this hired hand we had was a big kid, not necessarily the brightest bulb, but could sure enough gentle a horse. And he grabbed one of them sacks of grain. It was an 80-pound sack of Milo that was sewed on top and had ears on the corners. He grabbed one of those ears and stepped up on that little pony and went to beating him over the head with that 80-pound sack of Milo for bucking me off. It was kind of funny to watch, but, just hard lessons. And I rode several colts until I got to be about age 11. And then I got hired to start riding colts when I was at age 11. Didn't know much about what I was doing. Still a lot of learn by doing in the old ways. We were hard on horses back then. Those that survived getting broke, some of them made horses and some of them just lost everything. They'd pack you around, but that's all they would do for you. But I learned early on that if you wanted to be good with cows, you had to be good with horses. So I always worked at getting better with my horses and my cattle. And I was riding some day labor at various ranches in that country. Time I was 11, 12 years old, on through when I got out of high school. Of course, we had that packing plant, and I was in 4-H, and I'd buy a bunch of 4-H steers and feed them out and sell them to all the merchants before the 4-H fair, and that's what put me through college for the most part. That and riding colts, and I was getting $40 a month, and Dad was finding the colts, so that $40 a month was more like $40 every 4 months. I put a lot of tracks on a colt for a $40 bill, but it kept me a horseback. Had one guy in that country that, I don't know, he took a liking to me, and he would bring me horses that weren't necessarily colts. They were horses that he needed rode. He traded more horses. Jimmy Grimsley was his name. Traded more saddle horses than anybody I ever met. I mean, he was awesome. He had a little 600 cow outfit out east of Trinidad, and he'd drop a horse off. I'd be going to school, and I'd come out in the evening, and there'd be a new horse in the corral, and the horse I'd been riding would be gone. And he'd always leave a little message with them horses, like teach him to go. Stopping comes natural. Here was a horse that absolutely couldn't get his feet to go. And I spent 30 days teaching that horse that when I asked him to, he needed to move out. And another little horse that he said that, the horse that runs back to the barn just hasn't run far enough away from the barn. And he was a barn-soured son of a gun. You get him 100 yards from the house and he's going back. So we spent 30 days getting away from the house, got it going. But I rode a lot of horses like that for him over the years up through high school. Got out of high school and went on to college, got a degree, wanted to be a vet, but figured out that I didn't want to memorize all the holes in a dog's head. You know, I grew up around a lot of dogs. Where we lived was about a mile and a half north of Trinidad, so we had a lot of town dogs and some feral dogs and some coyotes running in packs. When you saw a dog, you got rid of it. That's all there was to it. You didn't tolerate a dog. Anyway, I got into vet school and dropped out the first quarter. I just couldn't get my mind to memorizing everything they wanted me to. And I went on and got a degree. And the time I was a junior, senior in college, I finally got into some instructors that wanted to teach me something. Some of them that actually knew something to teach. And I ended up studying a lot of breeding and nutrition, animal breeding. Learned how to breed cows artificially. And before I got out of school, I'd actually collected some bulls and extended the semen and sold it and stuff there through CSU. Spent a lot of time working for some really, really good teachers back then. In those last couple of years, my last 7 hours to get graduated actually came from working at the bull farm and at the stud farm under Dr. Pickett, who was considered the number 2 man in male reproduction at that time in the nation, second only to Dr. Foote out of Wisconsin. He taught me a lot, and I was working with Dr. Wiltbank at that time, and he was considered the first, or number 1 in female reproduction in the nation. And he knew things and taught me things that when I got out of school, he was right on what he said and what he did. And a lot of them teachers, they couldn't tell you the difference between a hog and a horse. They didn't know. He did. And actually got a lot of that stuff and put it to work right away. He got me my first job out of school. And it was on AI project, the largest beef AI project to date at that time. You know, we didn't have the heat synchronization. We were still working on that. That was in the process, but it wasn't good. So we would heat detect cows twice a day and gather the hot cows and breed them the next day. And it was a lot of horseback work and, a lot of technical stuff. And it was good. You learned a lot about cows. If you've ever sorted out a hot cow out of 250, you'll know what I'm talking about, because their minds don't work the same. They're thinking about other things, and you got to get them in there and get them in calm and try not to have to rope them. Though there were a few that we had to lead in, but not many. We learned how to get them in gently so that our conception rates would stay up. And I followed that for 2 or 3 years. Went to Georgia and South Carolina and Nebraska, 2 or 3 places in Colorado. And it was good because it paid. It was more than cowboy wages. Cowboy wages then was paying about $400 a month. If you had a good job, they were paying me $1,800 a month plus expenses, which was good money in the early 70s. But then cow market got soft, and like it always does, and they quit breeding cows like that, because there was, it definitely improved your herd genetics, but it cost. It was expensive to do. So those people kind of quit doing it. I went back to punching cows and ended up riding a lot of yearling outfits and, traveling quite a bit, always hunting a better job, something that was permanent, something I could call my own. Sometimes it worked. Well, it never worked, but some of those jobs were better than others. Some of them just really fell apart and they weren't really good at all. You'd work for 6 months and get fired because they had somebody that worked for half what you was making. So you were down the road. But I got to ride a lot of horses in a lot of country and see things that a lot of people never have. Spent a lot of time in cow camps by myself, which is always an interesting thing, when you got 1,500 head of steers and four head of horses, and you spend all day riding steers. And you rope a lot of cattle. You doctor a lot of cattle that way. And, it was good. I enjoyed it. Anyway, I got into a deal there. It was back when the government decided they could count cows, and they put a moratorium on the price of beef because they said we were really down in cow numbers, and they wouldn't, your market went away, and these traders and speculators and whatnot were paying a ton of money for calves. They were paying $1.05 for calves in the country, fall delivery. Come September, 1st of September, when the government took that moratorium off the price of beef, they dropped to a third of that. And them calves brought 40 cents through the sale barn. So traders and bankers and speculators, they were gone. I mean, they had no money left at all. Those of us working for some of them didn't get paid very well. I had a deal that I had a part of, supposed to get a percentage of, and I thought that would be a good boost. I would have something of my own that I could work on. But when that thing fell apart, I was left with nothing. I ended up living in town, spent the winter bartending, and actually played waiter in a steakhouse for a while, sold steaks, to customers, which is the other end of the beef world from where I was raised at. Ended up trying to sell real estate, and that didn't go very good because I'm not very good at convincing somebody they need to spend their money. Worked on that for, maybe 10 years, and there's some other side story that goes along with that we're not going to get into today. Come out of there, and I met my wife. She's a folklorist, and I met her at a cowboy poetry thing in Silk, Colorado. Vess Quinlan introduced us. We kind of fiddled around a little bit. She was married and in the process of getting a divorce, and I was recently divorced, and we got to hanging together at some of these gatherings and whatnot, and ended up a year after we met, just a little over, we got married. And I got to go into a lot of cowboy poetry gatherings and stuff, and got back into some horses and got some good horses, and started learning more about working horses then. Bought her first horse, and he was really quite a horse, a lot of stories on that horse. I started riding quite a bit of day labor for various ranchers and stuff, going to a lot of brandings. I was helping brand at like 5 different outfits at one time there in the spring of the year. And it was a lot of fun. It was good. Got to see a lot of country and riding some good horses. That kind of progressed on through, and a friend of mine that I had met when I was in college was raising some horses, and she needed some colts rode, and she started bringing me colts. She'd bring me 3 head of horses, and I'd get to keep one out of the bunch and, get the other 2 sold. And that was working out pretty good, but we ended up with needing a better market for horses. So I started showing horses and started showing in the versatility ranch horse world, and learned what a broke horse is all about. Cowboy horses are cowboy horses, but you get some of those versatility ranch horses out there, and you go to punching cows on them, you're mounted. You've got a horse you go do anything on, anytime, anywhere. It's amazing what some of those horses could actually do. And got some good breeding and really smart horses. And I took 4 head of horses, and I'll call them roll your owns, because I took them from colts, never rode colts, to competing against the best people in the nation and holding my own with it. Not beating them very often, but often enough that they paid attention when I rode in the pen. And I thought that was good. I really, really enjoyed that. But my horses come out pretty spectacular. And through marketing some of those colts that Marilyn had raised, got involved in the 4-H program. I sold a gelding to a lady whose kid was in 4-H and got to riding, and I ended up getting involved in the 4-H program big time, and still am in the state of Colorado, though I am getting old and getting tired, and I like the kids and I like the horses, and right now I've got a bunch of parents that are buying colts for kids that neither one of them know what's going on, and it's going to make for an interesting summer this year, because things aren't always going to be like Mama thinks they ought to be. We'll get through it somehow. We'll make this work. I know enough about riding horses, and colts particularly, that if you want to make a good horse, you spend 60 days on that horse. And that's not 60 days over 2 years. That's 60 days in a row, every day, and not too much, but 45 minutes to an hour, and then you quit and you go back to it the next day until you get it right. Just the way of working the horse to get your horses right. You can overdo a horse so quick by trying to get something to happen and repeating it over and over and over again pretty quick. His horse says, I have no idea what you're wanting, so I ain't gonna do anything. And that's what you end up with just because you push too hard.
In the book Cowboy Poets and Cowboy Poetry, Tom and Ronna Lee Sharpe wrote an essay entitled Some Folks Wouldn't Understand It, a study of Henry Herbert Knibbs. They state that Nibs never made a dime as a working cowboy, and then say this: it is not often that writings by non-cowboys are accepted by working cowboys, but Harry Nibs, as his friends called him, spent a lot of time traveling in the Southwest, learning the language and the ways of those who lived and worked there. I asked Tom to talk about Nibs and how he first discovered poetry.
I had an uncle that was a veterinarian, and when I was 13 years old, he gave me a copy of a Western Horseman magazine that had Tying Knots in the Devil's Tail in it. And that was the first poem I learned at the age of 13. And like I would say 50% of the people out there, that's the first poem they learned. It's a good poem, it's funny. But I went on and started learning poems, would find them various places, magazines. I learned some stuff I learned one thing off of a Bill Anderson record. It was kind of a narrative song that he did called The Golden Guitar. And it's really a great piece of work. It's a great piece of writing. Then I just pick up something and learn it. And, in them cow camps, I started writing stuff because I thought I could and worked at it. And once in a while, two words would come together right. Never really much, I wrote a lot of stuff and put it all down in notebooks, and then I'd lose the notebooks, which is probably a good thing because that stuff wasn't worth keeping much anyway. So I always had a love for poems and got involved in the cowboy poetry thing. Baxter Black actually got me involved. So I went to college at the same time Baxter did. And I was never a friend of his, but I was around him. And if you were ever around Baxter at a party, you'd never forget him. And I didn't. He was on a Johnny Carson show one night, and I saw him, and he was talking about the Cowboy Poetry Gathering. And I stayed up and watched that night, and then started looking into things, and I ended up back in Colorado. I was living in Missouri at that time. Come back to Colorado and read the paper. They were going to have a little gathering over in Durango, fall of '89, and I went. And was just totally floored by the number of people and the poems and what was actually there. Run across two people that met for the first time, and they had been friends all my life. It's just somebody that you're so much alike to them that you've known each other. You know how they're going to react to everything that they do. And on first meeting, one was Rod McQuarrie, who we lost several years ago, and the other was Ross Knox. And I also met a guy there by the name of Vess Quinlan. He recited a poem called Mondo, and I knew Mondo. Vess and I had run kind of in the same country and kind of overlapped a little bit, so we knew a lot of the same people from that southern Colorado world. I was living in the San Luis Valley at that time, and he started putting together writing groups, so I started going to writing groups. And the more I was around, the more little gatherings I went to, I'd hear things and like them and learn them. And it got to be a lot of fun, spent a lot of time traveling to gatherings. And this was back in the day when you went on your own nickel. I mean, you bought your own motel room, you paid for your own fuel, the whole 9 yards. Nobody paid you to do anything. But I heard some stuff and got involved in learning about some of the writers, people like Bruce Kiskaden, who actually was a cowboy And he punched cows in the same country I was raised in. And in doing some research on him, I come across family names of people that I knew growing up that he had worked for 50 years before. It was kind of interesting. And one day I run across a poem called Mr. Boomer Johnson. Everybody knows it. Everybody recites it or did at one time. And I figured anybody that could write a poem as good as that could write two that good. So I went to researching on Henry Herbert Knibbs, who wrote that poem, and did a ton of research on him. Lots of books, and discovered poems that he had written back in the teens, in the 20s, and published in books that nobody had ever heard of. Poems like Where the Ponies Come to Drink, Rainmakers, and some of this other stuff that's really, really good, you know. There were a few of his poems out, but nothing that good. And Ronald Lee being a folklorist, we went to California and got into the archives at Stanford where Nibs' stuff is housed, and got to go through a lot of artifacts and old writings and letters and stuff about Nibs and his early life. Found a book in that deal that it was called To a Boy I Knew, and it was written by Turbesay Loomis, Charles Loomis's daughter. And he was living with Turbesay at that point, because when he went west and learned about the West, he had been married. And we read letters that his wife had wrote to him while he was living in the Southwest, begging him to come back, and on and on and on. And it didn't take long to figure out why he left the East and came west. And he never did divorce her, but he was living with Turbesay when he passed away in 1945.
Where was home for him in the East?
New York. He was a bookkeeper at a coal deal, if I remember correctly. Family farm. He talked, in part of that book, he talked about his fascination with horses came from riding behind a team of horses that his granddad was driving, and watching their hips move up and down like sewing machine needles, and their ears flipping back and forth like little soldiers and stuff like this. It's a fabulous piece of work. It's never been published. Doubt that it'll ever be published. It was really, really a good read. Really enjoyed that. But we got a lot of, learned a lot about Nibs. He, born and raised in the East, and he come west. He went to college. I don't know that he ever graduated. He went to 2 or 3 different colleges. He came to the West, I'm sure, to escape his wife, and traveled, and I'm not real sure all where, but he spent some time in Arizona, Nevada, and California, and some of that deal. We visited with Turbesay Loomis's, would have been her nephew, maybe, the only living relative or person that had anything to do with Nibs that we ever knew. And he knew Nibs. And he told me that Henry Herbert Knibbs never earned a dime as a cowboy. He wasn't a cowboy. But he studied the language and the people and how things went to where he could actually write about it, and write about it well. Back in that era, a lot of them dime novels and stuff written by people from back east, and they really weren't that good because those people didn't understand the West. Nibs did. Nibs had studied it well enough to be able to put what he saw in writing and make it work. But he was, he wrote several novels, and his novels were like a lot of the other novels of that era. Just, they're just there. They're worth the $3 or $4 that you pay for them today. Just to say you own one, they're not a good read. Of course, I'm particular with my reading. I grew up that way. I can't read Louis L'Amour, because the 3rd book of his I read said the same thing as the 1st book of his I read. There was nothing new. But I grew up reading things like Leon Uris, and I read everything Steinbeck wrote. And this was before I got into high school that I was reading this stuff. And James Clavell and some of those really, really good writers. So I've always had an interest in good words. Started writing when I was in cow camps because I couldn't afford to buy paperback books to keep me reading. You go to town and go to the discount place, or, pay a nickel a piece for 4 or 5 books, and you have them read before you could get back there in a month. So you just run out of money to buy books. But Nibs was an interesting person. I know several of his poems, and they're easy to learn because they're so well rhythmed. He spent his later life running a violin shop in San Francisco, building fiddles. That's what he did. And his talent as a musician put the rhythm into his poems that make them very readable.
You mentioned, kind of discovering some of those poems. That you mentioned Where the Ponies Come to Drink, mm-hmm. which is now a very well-known classic. Were you the one who really brought that out to the public, or did other people know of that one?
No, nobody knew of it. Nobody had heard of it. I found it in a book and read it, and then gave the book to Vess, because we were living in San Luis Valley at the same time. And Vess found it and called me, and I learned it. And I was the first person that ever recited that poem in public to my knowledge.
It's interesting that so few of Nibs' poems really entered the oral tradition. Mm-hmm. Boomer Johnson being one. And
right. He wrote one called Walking John, which had some interest. You saw it once in a while. Charlie Lee had some interest.
Punching the Dough.
Punch and Dough was another one of his funny poems that had some interest. Yeah. Some people recited, not really that well known. Not like Where the Ponies Come to Drink is today, not even close, or Boomer Johnson ever was. Mm-hmm. Nibs was just, I don't know, he was interesting, for somebody who had never punched cows, but had been around it enough to understand it, to be able to write it. That fascinated me because, you got to work at it to learn that. It's like working colts. You got to work at it to learn how to get it right. And I don't know that I'll ever get it right, but I'm way better than I used to be.
Nibs also had such a fascination just with not just the cowboy West, but the West in general, and he wrote a lot of hobo poems. Did he spend time hoboing around?
My guess is from his writing. I never heard this from Kenneth Loomis that we talked to, but my guess is, yes, he spent some time bumming and hoboing around and, riding a grub line or something along this line to get the knowledge to be able to do this. And how he financed that, I have no idea. So, yeah, he did some hoboing. He wrote some sea poems that were pretty good. I know so little about the sea other than it's big and wet. He was definitely a poet. He wasn't a prose writer. His prose were just there. Well-written work. Having the words correct, having the rhythm, the rhyme correct, never forcing a rhyme. I write both free verse and rhyme poems, depending on the poem. And I can't say I'm going to write a rhyme poem today. It all depends on how that poem is and what happens with it and whether it fits in one side or the other. But Vess taught me to write poetry with a knife. If you don't need that word, don't use it. If you don't need that verse, don't use it. Make sure that it's important to the story that you're trying to tell if you're going to use this. And it made my writing pretty tight. A year ago, a little over now, I started writing some short stories. I had some poems that I wanted to publish in another book, my second book, and I felt like they were pretty good poems. I still feel that way. But I had a lot of stories that I just didn't feel like putting into a poem. So I started writing these stories. And like my poetry, they're short. I mean, we're talking stories that run 300 to maybe 400 words max, and tell the whole story in that, and make it interesting and leave enough out to make it interesting. I see too many people that, particularly with their poetry, I mean, they're going to tell you the whole story, everything, and they drone on and on and on, and pretty quick you're lost. It never gets to where you want it to be. Your mind goes away before they ever get to where they're at with their story. I try not to do that. I try to keep it tight enough that the reader or reciter has an interest all the way through it. And these stories are that way. But the stories that I have wrote are they're very personal. They're true. Some people, I gave one to a guy to look at, kind of edit for me. And he said, well, I want the rest of this story. And it was a story about probably the one and only time I was ever on a golf course. And I was there horseback. And they say that's not the way to be on a golf course. You're not supposed to lope little circles around the little flag on the flat green. That's not supposed to be the way it is. He wanted more of that story. He wanted me to expand this, because he had done a lot of editing and writing in his life, and he's got to put everything in there. I told him, no, that's it. And then he got, after he read a half a dozen of those things, he got to understanding how they're written. And I run across a lady a couple of years ago in Elko. We were sitting on the winer's bench together visiting, and she's a writer. She taught creative writing for years. I read something that she had wrote on the internet, and I went back to her and I said, well, I've wrote this little thing and need your opinion of it. I don't know whether it was any good or not. And she came back and said, well, just like most writers, she says, you got it backwards. What do you mean? She says, well, the last paragraph in this story should be the first paragraph in this story. So a lot of these little stories that I write, they start at the end, and then they fill in all the blanks, or as much of the blanks as you're going to get. It takes work. You got to work at it. The more you write, the better off you are. The better you can write. The more you ride horses, the better horseman you're going to be if you work at it. If sitting on board and not falling off is your idea of being a horseman, then you're not working at it. I got a story in here about a horse. It's not a story, actually. It's a poem about my wife's first horse. And I was sorting some heifers. And we had about 40 head of these heifers I had to get out of these cows that were calving. And, I've rode, and I told these guys this morning, the same thing, that I've had lots of horses in my life that I could ride into 200 head of mother cows and pick out a cow that I wanted and look at that cow. And that horse would put that cow through the gate that we had just come through. And you didn't have to do anything. You didn't pick up your hand. You didn't say anything. You didn't move a foot, nothing. You looked at that cow, and that cow went out that gate. That horse did that job. And sometimes it's surprising how good they are at that. Horses can read cows way better than we can. But that's learning how to ride a horse correctly, getting out of his way. And it's the same thing with my writing. I want to get out of the way of too much stuff to just express what I want to say and no more. And then call it good. I think it makes for better poetry. J.B. Allen, I don't know that he wrote anything that was multiple page size poems. I really don't. He might have some that were 2, maybe one that went on to 3 in one of his books, but most of his poems were on 1 page. He wrote really tight. and really good. And people like JB encouraged me a lot. JB was a good friend. And he encouraged me a lot, and as did a lot of other people, to write more, appreciate what I'm doing. And today, with my writing, there are some people that if they like what I did, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter whether the crowd likes it, whether anybody buys it, whatever. If those people appreciate what I do, that's all that matters to me. I rode out of a horse show class one time, world show in Oklahoma. Everybody that I met, riding back to where I rode into that pen from, around that arena, and this included the people the top 5 players in that class that won that class that day, told me how great of a job I had done in that class. The judges didn't think so, but it didn't matter. My peers thought it was a great job, or they wouldn't have said that, because those people don't tell you you did good if you didn't. Vest told me a long time ago that if you want praise for your poem, give it to your mother. And he's right. I've learned to appreciate the opinions of certain people in my life. Some of them you know well, and they're good writers. Some of their work I read, I study their work. You have to keep in mind that I'm a traditionalist, okay? And to me, cowboy poetry is written by people who have spent long periods of time looking through the southbound of a northbound cow on a horse. They get a different perspective of life when they do that. There's a different ring to what they do if they actually understand the cow. It would be like me trying to write a firefighter poem. I could probably write a firefighter poem, but the firefighters wouldn't have the appreciation for it because I'm not authentic. They would know immediately that I'm not there. And there's just something about that. I see people on the street today that I can tell you, and they're not dressed for it. You've never seen them before in your life, but they spent some time on horseback. You can just tell. The way they move, the way they handle themselves just tells you that. And it's the same thing with cowboy poetry. We've seen a lot of the cowboy poetry world go into the entertainment world as opposed to the traditional cowboy poet. And there's a place for that. I mean, that's where Henry Herbert Knibbs comes in and some of these others. Who was the guy from the Dakotas that was a ranger up there?
Charles Badger Clark.
Clark. He was never a cowboy. But, a lot of his work was accepted, as being authentic. And it's the ring that he got from having spent time out there to do that, like Nibs did. And I hear that, see that today, see it in some of your singers. I'm big on words. That chicken and the egg thing, the words came first, not the song. If you don't have the words, you can't sing it. You can always find music if the words are right. Go look at people like Guy Clark, fabulous writer. I know some of Guy Clark's work. I've listened to it and studied it, and he's a poet. He was a good writer. But that's what he was. He was a writer. He was an artist. He was a writer. And that's what he did. But he had a lot of life experiences too. And if you're going to write something and you don't have any experience with it, then you can't put the ring there that it needs to have. When I first met Rod McQuarrie, they had their first gathering in Durango that year. and they had a little guest ride, a little trail ride that they were going to do. And it was down through some of that country where the Anasazis lived and down through that. It's kind of interesting country. It really was. And I didn't want to go. I had horses that I was riding, and I didn't feel like I wanted to go sit on somebody else's plug along. So anyway, I showed up just as they were starting to come back, and Rod was one of the first people that come back, never met him before. And I watched him. He rode up that trail, and he come in there, and he unsaddled that horse, and he brushed him off, and hung his saddle on the fence, and got everything cleaned up and hung right, put it away, put his horse away, and then come over and introduced himself. And then there was a couple of yokels that showed up there, and they kind of wannabes, and they come charging in with their horses and throw their saddles in the dirt, and, big-time cowboys. It didn't work for me. It's the same thing with the words, same thing with the poems. I've lived around, still know a lot of cowboys who they want to prove they're tough, because cowboys are supposed to be tough. That's not how you handle cows and horses correctly. It just makes you tough. This is a poem that I have spent 2 years trying to learn, and I cannot get it to stick in my head. My head's bounced off a lot of rocks, and things don't stick there good anymore. It's a little thing I called From Force to Feel. Unknowingly we rode them hard, grandfather's skills applied. The horses knew we didn't know, and bless them how they tried. They gave their all to understand and suffered as they went. We pushed for more at every turn until their spirit bent. The bending often caused the break. No longer did they care, so went about their daily work with eyes in empty stare. Then elders who had studied hard, taught less had more effect, developing a sense of feel and how to show respect for how the horse's mind would work with ask instead of tell. When the giving, not the taking, cast the wondrous spell of horse and rider being one with melding of the minds, the softest touch to move the feet. So motion thus entwines till knowingly we ride with them, response at slightest touch, and comprehend the consequence of when it is too much. But the learning isn't gifted. It comes through sacrifice, patience, practice, and commitment, and pay the potent price of evading prior learning, foregoing places past, recognizing what's unknown, till mind and heart are cast toward man and horse becoming one, with timing, touch, and feel, and partnership is fashioned up where horse gets best of deal.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Tom Sharpe for taking the time to visit with me. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons, Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, Scott Anderson, Paige Marie Polis, Gabe Rosen, and Helen DeZio for their support of this episode. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.